So it was a Tuesday morning, and I was just getting breakfast ready when my phone rang. I was living in Mesa, planting my first church, Song of Life, and one of the members of that church, Shara, was the voice I heard on the phone. And she hurriedly asked me, "Are you watching TV?" How many of you remember where you were on 9/11? 18 years ago, the world as we knew it totally changed. And this will be the first year since it happened that everyone currently in elementary, middle, and high school was not yet or just barely born. So this event is history to them, like the Civil War is to us, as is the story of Noah and the ark, both events that shook the world. Doesn't it seem to you that earth-shattering events have sort of multiplied over the years, both natural and human-caused? I mean, just in the last 3 weeks, we've experienced another mass shooting, Hurricane Dorian, flash floods in Kenya, a massive fire in the rainforests of the Amazon, vaping deaths among our young people, a boat fire that killed 29 off the coast of California, and the list doesn't even begin to stop there. So I can only imagine that there are days that many of us simply wonder, what could possibly be next? Now, we often respond, don't we, in positive ways. We join an activist group trying to deal with world problems, or we send money to UMCOR, or we do a mission project to address a particular need. We pray. We do everything in our power to prepare for emergencies in case something happens to us. But the state of always being on the edge is impacting our society in some very real ways. And we seek for light at the end of the tunnel. We seek for support from one another. And as followers of Jesus, we look for God at work in all of it. But culturally, it sure seems that we're sort of on a standstill. I mean, we fight each other instead of listening. Compromise, which is the very basis of our democracy, has eroded over many, many years, and instead of finding solutions that work for the common good, we retreat into our corners and we hold our ground, and we end up getting nothing done. So conversation ceases and violence increases, and we see that happening all around the world, across cultures, even in our schools. Bullying and suicide, senseless violence to our young people express not the safety that we once expressed and expected as a society, but an atmosphere more of hatred and despair. No one seems to want to take responsibility for what they're thinking or feeling or experiencing. It's always someone else's fault, and so we look for scapegoats. We look for someone to blame instead of taking ownership for the state of the world. René Girard, who's a historian, demonstrated that what he called this scapegoat mechanism is probably the foundational principle for the formation of most groups and cultures. We seldomly consciously know that we're scapegoating or projecting. As Jesus said, people literally don't know what they're doing. In fact, the effectiveness of the whole scapegoating mechanism relies on us not seeing it. It's automatic, it's ingrained, and it's unconscious. She made me do it. He is guilty. He deserves it. They are the problem. That is just pure evil. Or the epitome, the place where it all started. Adam said, "God, the woman that you gave me, she made me eat." Now, you would think that humans should be able to recognize their own negativity and sinfulness, but instead we largely hate or blame almost anything else. I know that I'm certainly guilty of this, and I'm working really hard to overcome that. How about you? Is your immediate reaction when somebody catches you doing something that you maybe haven't done the best to your ability? Do you try to lay blame on someone else or a circumstance or a situation, or you just sort of say, you know what, yeah, I blew that one? How are you doing? Because unless we can become aware that we're scapegoating and we name it through acknowledging our mistakes, the pattern will largely remain unconscious and unchallenged. You know that it took until the 20th century for modern psychology to recognize how humans almost always project what they call their unconscious shadow material, which is psychobabble for those things that are inside of us that we certainly don't want to look at, and we definitely don't want anyone else to know about us. But Jesus revealed that pattern over 2,000 years ago when he said, when anyone kills you, they will think they're doing a holy duty for God. We recognize we usually hate our own faults that we see in other people. You know, those things that really bug you about someone else are usually those things that you don't admit are going wrong in your own life or that you don't like about yourself. And sadly, both God and religion have been used to justify most of the violence we've seen throughout history, as well as to hide those shadow parts of ourselves. Because you know what? We're good church people. We can't let anybody see that really ugly things might be going on inside us. Because, you know, first of all, they might not come to church. Second of all, they might think we're really bad people. And third of all, it's because we're not ready to face those things in our own lives. And so I find it really interesting that Jesus stands as the innocent, sinless one who is condemned by the highest authorities of church and state of his day, Rome and Jerusalem. So we have Jesus on the one hand. And then we have those who both the church and the state tend to admire, who are often guilty of pride and ambition and greed and false witness and sanctioned killing and vanity and a whole lot more. So we have that whom we professed to believe and to follow on the one hand, and we have those leaders who have raised up who seem to be absolutely the opposite of everything Jesus seems to stand for. And we wonder, why is it that disaster reigns in the world? But as John puts it, Jesus will continue to show the world how wrong it was about sin, about who was really in the right, and about true judgment. And that's what Jesus exposed and defeated on the cross. You see, he didn't come to change God's mind about us. It didn't need changing. Jesus came to change our minds about God. That it's not just all the little things we do that are somehow going to keep us away from God. It's about a breaking in relationship that keeps us apart from the love of God. He came to show us where goodness and evil really lie, and friends, both of them are inside of us and in the world. And I find it really fascinating that this pattern has been around throughout history, and we see that clearly in our story today of Noah and the flood. One of those biblical narratives that we are so familiar with that we tend to think that we know the whole story. And in fact, what we tend to think of as the story is really one of two interpretations that are common in our culture. So on the one hand, and probably the most common interpretation is very much a children's story of Noah's family and animals and rainbows, about remembering God's love each time we see a rainbow, or even how we see the bright side of every storm. Now, the second common interpretation is a story that is most definitely not for children, because in this interpretation, God is so angered by human rebellion that God floods the whole earth, wiping out nearly everything in a fit of divine rage. And frankly, that's a story about a God whom you would be crazy to want to have anything to do with. A God of wrath, who is ready to strike down sinners by destroying them all? Well, neither of those stories is the truth. Neither actually contains very much truth. A truer story is that God has a myriad of ways of calling us back into the harmony that God intended for us. Did you know that the story of Noah actually has two different writers in the middle of it? You can tell that because one story says that there were pairs of animals that were put on the ark, 2 by 2. How many of you know that story? Okay, that's the one we're all familiar with. Well, if you read the story of Noah, you'll also find a different version in there where, yes, God puts 2 by 2, but then God adds extra animals so Noah will have something to sacrifice when he gets off the ark. You don't believe me? Go read it. So our text for today, in which God establishes a covenant with Noah and with his descendants, which include us, tells us that God is hanging up the bow, putting aside forever the option of destruction by flood and seeking to recreate us as God's own. You see, this entire flood story is the culmination of a story of increasing human sinfulness, separation from God, that begins with the fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, when they decide that they no longer trust God for everything in their lives, but think that they can take some power into their own hands. So we see first this disharmony between humans and God, between male and female, between humans and the animals, humans and their earthly labors. And then we see this disharmony intensifying in chapter 4, in which the first murder, a brother killing a brother, occurs. And then we see a genealogy in chapter 5 that links Adam's descendants to Noah in order to highlight this downward spiral of humanity. And finally, in chapter 6, just before our reading of today, we see the breaking of God's harmonious world, that world that God planned from the very beginning, where God and humans were interacting together, where we were meant to be in constant and open relationship with God. And the entire cosmos is thrown into chaos and disorder, and humanity is so broken that God regrets having made it in the first place. And the language of this divine regret is absolutely breathtaking. In verse 5 of chapter 6, God saw that every inclination of the thoughts of human hearts was only evil continually. And yet God's response to this realization is not one of anger and revenge. Rather, we read, God was sorry that he had made humankind on earth, and it grieved him in his heart. God is grieved, pained by the brokenness of creation. And then God sends this flood not as an act of revenge, but out of grief over the tearing apart of the right human relationship with God. So that just brought up a question for me. Would anything be bad enough for you to think of wiping out everything you had ever created? Sort of a sobering question, isn't it? And as we reflect on that reality, we come to understand in so many ways that humanity causes its own demise, and that God will always allow us to suffer the consequences of our bad behaviors. But the good news, everybody take a deep breath, it's not all bad. We're not ready to have another flood, I don't think. Every one of us has some good in our hearts still, so we're still doing okay. The good news is that there was always a yet with God. No matter how bad things get, there's always a yet with God. And that yet in this story is the ushering in of a new era of God's saving action, which is demonstrated by the covenant of the rainbow. You see, God doesn't wipe out creation entirely and then walk away. The flood is, in fact, the means of recreation. God washes the earth clean, and both God and the earth begin again. Creation is given a new beginning, a new opportunity to live in the harmony that God intended, truly a way out of no way. And God promises to Noah and all of his descendants, to all living creatures on earth. I mean, this is a covenant that God makes not only with people, but with the animals and all living things. And that promise is to never again destroy the earth by a flood. And the well-being of creation, we find, is absolutely important to God. And so we're called to partnership with God in bringing well-being wherever we are placed and are given the chance. Now, it's fascinating. Cataclysmic floods and rainbows put in the sky as promised from God, that's not just biblical. We find those stories in almost every ancient manuscript that we have discovered. Norse mythology, for instance, claims that the rainbow is a bridge from heaven to earth. And I love that image. The implication of that promise is that God will seek us and seek us, despite, maybe perhaps because of God's knowledge of everything we do, everything we think, everything that we feel, every shame that tends to take over our lives, that unveils our vision of God's reality and of how much God loves us as part of God's creation. And whatever is inside of our hearts that keeps us from hearing the harmony of all of life in God's care, we learn that God will never, ever stop loving us on a path to restoration. So God's rainbow covenant is this foundation of trust that allows us to journey through life, a journey of self-discovery that can, if we'll let it, lead us to a life that's renewed, that's large enough for us to admit our own shortcomings. We can be a force, you see, as a church that changes the trajectory of scapegoating, of blaming, of passing the buck, as we take ownership of our own feelings and our own actions and learning to work together for the common good of all creation. So this week, I'd like to challenge us to do two things as we're able to do them. The first would be, because we've had an actual flood lately, to look at the work of UMCOR and what they are doing with those who are affected by Hurricane Dorian and the tremendous floods that occurred in the Bahamas and along our eastern seaboard. The second thing is a bit harder, but I think will have long-lasting results for those of us who are really seeking connection and a solution to scapegoating issues that are so prevalent in our world today. So think for a moment of someone with whom you might be struggling, with whom maybe someday you might eventually have to have a conversation. And number one, commit to recognizing and putting down your own defensiveness when you think of having that conversation. Then second, commit to learning something in that discussion. Number three, commit to having a true dialogue instead of alternating giving speeches. You know what that means, right? I'm going to present my side, you're going to present your side, and then we'll just go. True dialogue and reflecting back and forth to each other. Commit to assessing whether you're the right person to say what is on your mind, because sometimes you're not the one. And fifth, commit to ending the discussion knowing that you have strengthened the relationship. I have had several of those conversations lately. And while they can be hard, they can also be a real blessing. You have challenged me, and I am committed to making Desert Skies a place where all of us listen, refuse to blame, take responsibility for making things better, because every single one of us is good. And every single one of us have some less than good tendencies. But my prayer is that we can openly deal with who we are together, so that our hearts will be constantly drawn to the love of God and God's world. You see, God's desire is to be saving every single one of us from the things that tend to bring us down. My prayer is that we give in to God's desire together. Amen.